When the Bolshevik Revolution erupted in Petrograd in the autumn of 1917, the tremors of that event rolled far beyond the borders of the old Russian Empire. To many observers across Europe, it looked like a bolt of lightning, sudden and violent, shattering the established order and setting aflame the dream of an international workers' uprising. For Lenin and his comrades, what had begun in Russia was never intended to remain confined there. The vision was openly proclaimed: a world revolution, a chain reaction that would topple monarchs, dethrone bourgeois governments, and replace them with councils of workers and peasants. This was not a hidden agenda, but a stated goal. And from the very first months after seizing power, the Bolsheviks poured resources, energy, and words into carrying the flame abroad. The immediate post-war period in Europe provided a fertile ground for such ambitions. The Great War had devastated economies, shattered societies, and left millions of men scarred by the trenches. Food shortages, inflation, unemployment, and the bitterness of defeat or hollow victory created a volatile mood. In Germany, Hungary, Italy, and other countries, the streets filled with restless crowds. Many felt betrayed by their ruling elites. The promise that had justified the sacrifices of the war had vanished, leaving behind hunger and disillusionment. Into this climate of despair came the new message from the East, whispered through underground channels, carried in newspapers and pamphlets, spread by envoys and agitators of the newborn Soviet state. Lenin believed fervently that Russia alone could not withstand the pressure of hostile capitalist powers. The revolution had to expand, or it would wither. That conviction led to the creation of the Comintern, the Communist International, in 1919. The Comintern was not merely a debating society of left-wing intellectuals. It was an instrument designed to coordinate and direct revolutionary activity across borders, to provide guidance and money, and to ensure loyalty to Moscow's line. Through it, the Soviet leadership sought to ignite uprisings and establish sister republics across Europe. The early attempts were dramatic, but short-lived. In Hungary, Béla Kun proclaimed a Soviet republic in 1919. For a few months, it attempted to apply Bolshevik methods, nationalizing industries and seeking to reorganize the army on class principles. But surrounded by enemies and lacking a stable base of support, it collapsed within the same year, crushed by foreign intervention and internal opposition. In Bavaria, revolutionary councils tried to replicate the Russian model. Red Guards patrolled Munich for a brief period, poets and idealists took ministerial chairs, and slogans painted walls. Yet within weeks, the experiment was drowned in blood as government troops and right-wing militias reasserted control. These failed republics became cautionary tales, proof both of the possibility of sudden upheaval and of the immense resistance that awaited any such project in the heart of Europe. Still, the spark had been struck. In Germany, one of the most advanced industrial nations, the communist movement gathered followers, especially in the chaotic years after the abdication of the Kaiser. Strikes paralyzed cities, workers' councils took shape, and uprisings flared. The Spartacist revolt of January 1919, though crushed with ferocity, demonstrated the existence of a radical vanguard ready to emulate Russia. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who were murdered in the aftermath, became martyrs in communist mythology. Their portraits would later hang beside Lenin's in countless meeting halls. Italy, too, witnessed waves of agitation. The so-called Biennio Rosso, the Red Years of 1919 and 1920, saw factories occupied, land seized by peasants, and the specter of revolution haunting the Italian elite. The fear of Bolshevism became one of the factors that propelled Benito Mussolini and his movement to prominence. Thus, in an ironic twist, the attempt to spread communism also contributed to the birth of its fiercest adversary, fascism. Across Europe, governments reacted with alarm. Police raids, new laws, mass arrests, and propaganda campaigns all sought to contain what newspapers called the Red Plague. In Britain, France, and the newly formed states of Central Europe, communists were often forced underground. They operated through clandestine cells, printing presses hidden in basements, and couriers crossing borders with secret messages. Even so, the very existence of these movements kept alive the notion that capitalism was not invulnerable, that a different system had already triumphed somewhere to the east. The Soviet leadership followed these developments with keen interest. Moscow became a beacon for radicals who traveled there to attend Comintern congresses. Delegates from dozens of countries filled the halls, hearing speeches that combined fiery rhetoric with practical instructions. They were told to agitate among soldiers, to seize factories, to prepare for armed insurrection. Yet, after the disappointments of the first wave of revolutions, a more cautious tone began to creep in. Lenin recognized that sudden uprisings could not succeed everywhere. Instead, communists were urged to build disciplined parties, to penetrate trade unions, to wage a long struggle for influence until the moment of crisis would return. In these early years, the contrast between hope and fear was stark. For workers in poverty, the Bolshevik experiment seemed to offer dignity and power. For industrialists and landowners, it appeared as a mortal threat. Newspapers printed lurid stories of expropriations, executions, and chaos in Russia, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes accurate. The image of the revolutionary with a red flag became both an inspiration and a nightmare. By the mid-1920s, communism had not conquered Europe. Instead, it remained a force simmering beneath the surface. The first attempts had been beaten back, but the seed had been planted. It grew quietly in party offices, in union halls, and in the imagination of those who saw in the Russian Revolution not a catastrophe, but a prophecy. For the governments of Europe, the lesson was clear: vigilance must be constant. For Moscow, the lesson was different. Patience, organization, and persistence were required. Thus, the story of communism's absorption of Europe began not with sweeping victories, but with flashes of rebellion, crushed and silenced, yet never entirely extinguished. The October Revolution had turned the tide of history, and even though the West managed to repel its first echoes, the undercurrent remained. The continent stood restless, divided between the memory of war and the anticipation of another upheaval. It was only the beginning of a drama that would stretch across decades, a drama in which the line between liberation and domination, between justice and terror, would remain contested. The collapse of the old order after the Great War had left Europe exhausted but not at peace. In the early 1920s, governments tried to reconstruct shattered economies, redraw borders, and restore a sense of stability. Yet beneath the surface of fragile treaties and parliamentary debates, discontent simmered. Inflation swept through Germany, strikes erupted in Britain and France, and whole regions felt abandoned by elites who seemed unable to provide food, jobs, or dignity. Into this uncertain atmosphere, the communist message continued to seep, carried by the persistent efforts of parties tied to Moscow and by the anger of workers who had little to lose. The Comintern grew into an international hub of coordination. From its headquarters in Moscow, directives were sent out to parties across Europe, instructing them to agitate, to organize, and to prepare for decisive action. Delegates returned from congresses with carefully worded instructions, sometimes clashing with local realities, but always imbued with the belief that history was moving toward a grand confrontation between classes. The vision was stark. On one side stood the exploited masses, and on the other, the capitalist exploiters. The task was to awaken consciousness, to turn discontent into revolt, and to align every local struggle with the larger cause of world revolution. But history was not so easily bent. In Germany, the early 20s were marked by uprisings that flared and failed. The Ruhr Uprising of 1923, sparked by resistance to French occupation and economic collapse, brought thousands of workers into the streets. They raised red flags, seized factories, and declared councils. Yet the government responded with force, and the movement was crushed. Time and again, communists discovered that without mass support and without coordination, their attempts could not survive. The lessons were harsh, but they were not wasted. German communists reorganized, seeking to build a disciplined party that could outlast temporary defeats. They learned to use elections as platforms for propaganda, not merely as futile contests. They built networks in unions, in youth organizations, and in cultural circles. The party press became a powerful voice, distributing daily newspapers that reached hundreds of thousands. At the same time, the rise of right-wing forces, feeding on nationalist resentment and fear of Bolshevism, created a bitter rivalry that would dominate the next decades. In Italy, the turmoil of the Red Years receded as Mussolini's fascist movement rose to power. The black shirts offered order, nationalism, and violence against socialists and communists alike. For many Italians frightened by strikes and occupations, fascism seemed like the antidote to chaos. Thus, one of the most striking consequences of the Bolshevik experiment was the creation of its mirror opposite, a politics defined by hostility to the left. Communists in Italy were driven underground, persecuted, and forced into exile. Yet exile did not silence them. In Paris, in Moscow, in clandestine networks, they continued to spread their message and to wait for opportunities. The Great Depression of the 1930s offered such an opportunity. As banks collapsed, unemployment soared, and hunger returned to cities, communism seemed once again to speak the language of reality. In France, the Communist Party gained strength among workers who saw the promises of liberal democracy crumble. In Spain, radical currents surged within the labor movement, feeding into a broader struggle that would soon explode into civil war. In Germany, the communist vote rose, but so too did the appeal of the National Socialists, who promised national rebirth and crushed the space for leftist organizing. The Spanish Civil War became the defining arena of this ideological clash. When General Francisco Franco led a military revolt against the Republican government in 1936, Spain turned into a battlefield not only for Spaniards, but for the competing visions of Europe's future. On one side, communists, socialists, anarchists, and liberals fought to defend the Republic. On the other, fascists and conservatives, supported by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, sought to impose authoritarian rule. The Soviet Union intervened directly, sending weapons, advisors, and political commissars. Volunteers from dozens of countries traveled to Spain to fight in the international brigades, believing they were defending not only a republic, but the very principle of freedom against tyranny. The war in Spain was brutal and disillusioning. It showcased the heroism of ordinary men and women who crossed borders to fight for ideals, but it also revealed the dark side of communist intervention. Soviet agents imposed discipline, suppressed anarchist and Trotskyist factions, and sought to mold the Republican cause into a tool of Moscow's policy. The dream of solidarity was marred by purges, betrayals, and infighting. When Franco finally triumphed in 1939, the Republic lay in ruins, and Europe had witnessed both the power and the limitations of communist influence. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union itself, Stalin consolidated his grip. The purges of the late 30s echoed across Europe, sending shivers even through devoted party members abroad. Leaders of foreign communist parties were summoned to Moscow. Some never returned. The image of the Soviet Union as a workers' paradise was complicated by whispers of gulags, executions, and terror. Yet for many on the outside, the grim reports were overshadowed by the fact that capitalism itself seemed broken. In Britain and France, communist parties participated in popular fronts, coalitions that sought to unite all democratic forces against fascism. These fronts achieved limited successes, strengthening the left's voice and raising the specter of a broader alignment between Moscow and Western democracies. But beneath this fragile unity, mistrust persisted. Western elites feared that any alliance with communists would lead to subversion from within. The specter of the Bolshevik Revolution haunted boardrooms and ministries. Every strike was suspected of being orchestrated by Moscow, every protest interpreted as part of a larger plan. In some cases, these fears were exaggerated. In others, they were not unfounded, for the Comintern did maintain channels of support and influence. Thus, by the eve of the Second World War, Europe was ideologically fractured. Communism had not conquered the continent, but it had rooted itself deeply in many societies. It was a promise for the hungry and a nightmare for the privileged. It was a beacon for anti-fascists and a threat for conservatives. Above all, it was a force that refused to be extinguished, no matter how many times it was suppressed. The interwar decades had shown that the battle was not only about economics or politics, but about imagination. Was the future to belong to councils of workers, to fascist dictatorships, or to liberal democracies struggling to survive? The answer was not yet clear. But one thing was certain. The Soviet Union, through persistence and strategy, had ensured that its vision remained present in every crisis. every debate, every confrontation. The stage was set for the next chapter, when the Second World War would provide communism not just with a stage, but with armies, territories, and the chance to present itself as both liberator and ruler. The thunder of the Second World War transformed Europe more radically than any revolution of words or strikes could ever achieve. For decades, communism had been an idea on the margins, a banner raised by workers, a threat feared by elites, and a dream nurtured in Moscow. With the outbreak of war, that idea was suddenly carried forward by the march of armies, by the weight of millions of soldiers, and by the collapse of old regimes that had once seemed unshakable. When the German armies swept into Poland and then into the heart of Europe, the Soviet Union at first played a cautious and pragmatic game. The infamous pact between Moscow and Berlin divided spheres of influence, buying Stalin time and space while shocking the world. To many on the left abroad, it was a bitter betrayal. Yet to Stalin, it was a calculated necessity, a way to strengthen Soviet power before the inevitable confrontation. The occupation of the Baltic states and parts of eastern Poland extended Soviet reach, laying the groundwork for what would later become the communist sphere of Europe. Everything changed in the summer when Germany launched its vast invasion of the Soviet Union. The war became a struggle for survival, a clash of systems in which communism presented itself not merely as an ideology, but as the spirit of resistance. Entire cities, from Leningrad under siege to Stalingrad under bombardment, became symbols of endurance. Soldiers and civilians fought with a determination born not only of patriotism, but also of the conviction that they were defending a new kind of society, one that claimed to belong to the people themselves. As the Red Army gradually turned the tide, communism gained unprecedented legitimacy. Victories at Stalingrad and Kursk echoed across the world, transforming Soviet soldiers into heroes of anti-fascism. Communist parties in occupied Europe drew strength from this image. Resistance movements in France, Italy, Greece, and Yugoslavia often bore red flags alongside national symbols. Underground presses spoke of Moscow as the heart of resistance, and partisans received weapons and support from the Soviet Union. In these years, communism ceased to be a marginal force. It became the spearhead of liberation for millions living under Nazi occupation. In Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans fought a relentless guerrilla war, building liberated zones and creating a parallel administration even before the Germans were expelled. In Greece, communist-led fighters dominated the resistance, organizing both military and social structures that promised a new order. In France, the communists proclaimed themselves the party of the 75,000 executed, claiming the legacy of those who had given their lives in the underground struggle. Everywhere, the intertwining of national liberation and social revolution gave communism a fresh aura of legitimacy. When the Allied forces pushed into Western Europe, they too relied on local resistance. In many cases, that resistance had been shaped by communist militants who had risked everything in clandestine work. Thus, when liberation came, communist parties emerged from the shadows stronger than ever. They claimed a share of the victory, presenting themselves as essential actors in defeating fascism. This claim was not entirely unfounded, for their sacrifices had indeed been enormous. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, the Red Army's advance created a new reality. As Soviet troops entered Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and eventually Germany itself, they brought not only liberation from Nazi rule, but also the presence of a political system eager to extend its reach. Temporary coalitions were formed with local allies, but always under the watchful eye of Moscow. New governments included communists in key positions, controlling ministries of the interior, police, and information. Gradually, through pressure, alliances, and sometimes outright force, these coalitions shifted into regimes dominated by communists. The contrast between West and East became starker with each passing month. In Western Europe, communist parties gained strength through participation in democratic politics. In Italy and France, they won millions of votes, becoming mass parties with influence in parliaments and unions. In Eastern Europe, by contrast, the Soviet model was imposed more directly. Elections were manipulated, opposition was sidelined, and security services ensured loyalty. By the late 1940s, the outlines of a divided continent were unmistakable. The symbolism of Berlin captured this transformation. The city lay in ruins, occupied by the victors and divided into zones. Here, at the very heart of defeated Germany, two visions confronted each other face to face. In the east, Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag, proclaiming victory and signaling the dawn of a new order. In the west, American, British, and French authorities sought to rebuild institutions based on liberal democracy and capitalism. Berlin became the laboratory of division, a city that embodied the larger fate of Europe. For ordinary Europeans, the end of the war brought both relief and uncertainty. The fascist nightmare was over, but the future was contested. In Prague, Warsaw, Budapest, and Sofia, communist parties promised reconstruction, land reform, and justice for collaborators. In Rome and Paris, communists appealed to workers who demanded change after years of suffering. Everywhere, the allure of communism was tied to the memory of sacrifice and the hope for equality. But it was also shadowed by the realities of Soviet domination and the whispers of purges, gulags, and authoritarian control. The Second World War thus did more than destroy the old order. It created the conditions for communism to emerge as a central force in European politics. It provided the Soviet Union with both prestige and power. It gave communist parties the aura of resistance and the machinery of governance. By 1945, communism no longer stood at the margins. It stood at the very center of Europe's destiny, poised to reshape the continent in ways that would define the Cold War. The story of communism's rise could not be told without the story of war, for it was war that turned ideology into power, that turned parties into governments, and that transformed borders into front lines of a new conflict. The dream that had once flickered in underground cells and clandestine meetings now marched with armies and spoke through governments. The question was no longer whether communism would influence Europe, but how far it would extend and how deeply it would transform the lives of millions. The end of the Second World War left Europe scarred, its cities shattered, its populations exhausted, and its political future hanging in the balance. It was in this crucible that communism extended its grasp, not merely as an ideology, but as a structure of power anchored in the might of the Soviet Union. The liberation of Eastern Europe by the Red Army had already ensured that Moscow held the decisive influence, and Stalin moved swiftly to consolidate it. In the first years after the war, Eastern European nations still entertained the illusion of pluralism. Coalition governments were formed in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, often including socialist, peasant, and liberal parties alongside the communists. Yet behind the facade, key ministries were already in communist hands. Control over the interior, the police, and the press gave communists levers of authority disproportionate to their numbers. Elections were held, but intimidation, manipulation, and outright fraud tilted the scales. One by one, the non-communist voices were marginalized, silenced, or eliminated, until only loyal regimes remained. In Poland, the London-based government in exile found itself powerless against the reality of Soviet-backed institutions on the ground. In Hungary, promises of free political life quickly dissolved into purges and show trials. Romania and Bulgaria underwent similar transformations, their monarchies abolished and their societies reshaped under Moscow's guidance. Czechoslovakia, at first a beacon of democratic hope, fell under communist control after the coup of 1948, a moment that shocked the West and confirmed that the division of Europe was irreversible. This process was not only political, but also economic. The creation of the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, known as Comintern, bound Eastern European economies to the Soviet model. Land was redistributed, industries were nationalized, and central planning replaced markets. To some, these changes promised justice and equality after centuries of inequality. To others, they meant loss of freedom, shortages, and repression. In every case, the guiding hand was Moscow's, and deviation was not tolerated. The West responded with its own vision. The Truman Doctrine declared that America would support free peoples resisting subjugation, while the Marshall Plan poured billions into Western Europe's reconstruction. The formation of NATO in 1949 formalized the division into opposing blocs. What had once been a continent at war was now a continent split by ideology, with an invisible line running through its very heart. Winston Churchill gave it a name that would endure: the Iron Curtain. That curtain was not merely a metaphor, it was lived reality for millions. In Berlin, families were divided by political systems, their fates tied to the zones of occupation. In Budapest, Warsaw, and Sofia, dissenters found themselves imprisoned or exiled. In Prague and East Berlin, intellectuals and artists grappled with censorship and control. In every capital of the East, the shadow of Moscow loomed large. At the same time, in Paris, Rome, and Athens, communist parties remained powerful, drawing on wartime resistance legacies, yet constrained by democratic institutions and Western aid. The continent was torn not only geographically, but also psychologically, each side defining itself in opposition to the other. Resistance to this absorption did not vanish. In Hungary in 1956, a popular uprising demanded freedom from Soviet control, only to be crushed by tanks that rolled into Budapest. In Czechoslovakia in 1968, the Prague Spring sought to build socialism with a human face, but was extinguished by Warsaw Pact forces. These moments revealed both the strength of popular desire for autonomy and the unyielding grip of the Soviet system. The Iron Curtain was maintained not only by ideology, but also by the threat of force. For the West, these events reinforced the conviction that communism was not merely another political option, but a system of domination. For the East, they left scars of disillusionment and silence, where hope had briefly flickered. Generations grew up within this divided Europe, taught to see the other side as the enemy, even as shared culture, history, and family ties remained. The absorption of Europe by communism in the mid-20th century was thus both a triumph and a tragedy. It was a triumph for the Soviet Union, which had transformed wartime victory into geopolitical dominance. It was a triumph for communist parties that had long dreamed of power and now held it across half the continent. But it was also a tragedy for those who found their freedoms curtailed, their choices narrowed, and their futures dictated by distant leaders. The story of how communism engulfed Europe is not only a story of ideology imposed from above, it is also a story of genuine appeal to the dispossessed, of workers and peasants who believed in the promise of equality, of intellectuals who saw in socialism a path beyond fascism and capitalism alike. It is a story of hope entwined with fear, of liberation mingled with subjugation. Above all, it is the story of a continent divided, its destiny shaped not only by its own struggles, but by the titanic rivalry between East and West. By the late 1940s, the map of Europe had been redrawn without new borders being written on paper. The division was etched instead in institutions, alliances, and memories. The Cold War had begun, not as an abstract concept, but as a daily experience of checkpoints, propaganda, and suspicion. For decades to come, Europe would live with that division, its every political choice framed by the shadow of communism and the specter of confrontation. And yet, even in the darkest years of the Iron Curtain, the idea of Europe as a shared home never entirely vanished. Families whispered across borders, radios carried forbidden voices, and the longing for unity persisted. The absorption of Europe by communism was never total, never permanent. But in the age of its birth, it seemed unstoppable, as if history itself had been captured and directed from Moscow. The era of origins had ended. What followed would be a long twilight struggle, where ideas and armies, hopes and fears, clashed across the continent. The flames ignited by the Russian Revolution had by now swept far beyond Moscow. They had burned across Europe, reshaping it, dividing it, and defining the world order for a generation. Subscribe us. We don't say goodbye.